Jeffrey DeWood. I hope everybody's having a good night tonight. I know she said my presentation was going to be over residential energy, but I actually switched over to commercial power consumption, specifically in Georgia and Alabama. My objective for this analysis was to get some insight into some of the factors that determine power consumption in the commercial sector, and also to analyze the impact of some of the energy policies and standards that governments have put in place, as well as some standards like LEEDs. Here's some of the literature I reviewed. One that I found pretty helpful was the energy and efficiency trends in residential and commercial buildings, which is a document by the Department of Energy. Some background into energy efficiency is that standards have been improving over the recent years. LEED, which is a standard, it's non-governmental, but it's design leadership in energy efficiency design, and new international building codes have increased business awareness, cost savings. So like businesses are starting to construct buildings in ways that they save money on electricity costs. Another goal of this work is to gauge the impact of these new standards on power consumption. My main data, most of my data came from the Southern Company data set that the Southern Company was so nice to give to Dr. Smith, who shared it with me, which has data for Southern Company commercial sales, as well as residential and industrial. I focus mainly on commercial, and it included some of these independent variables, including the price of electricity and the total non-manufacturing employment, and commercial cooling days and heating degree cooling days is actually a measure of energy demand for those particular days. It reflects the demand for energy needed to heat a building for heating degree days, and cooling degree days does exactly the opposite for cooling degree days. Unfortunately, commercial heating degree data, was incomplete, so I substituted residential heating degree data because it correlated with, when I compared cooling degree data for residential and commercial, and they correlated 99%. So I figured it was an appropriate substitute. Some of the other independent variables I used were different versions of LEED. These seem to be two of the more substantial versions of them. And as I said, LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's a green building certification program that recognizes best-in-class building strategies, and it sort of sets a standard for buildings. Some of the other data I used was these policies that the state governments put in place. For example, when Alabama adopted Standard 90.1, which is a set of new energy standards for lighting, heating, and cooling, and the Georgia also adopted a similar standard, the IECC 2009, which is the International Energy Conservation Code. And the GEC, which was a Georgia Energy Challenge, was sort of like a previous standard that was set. Here's some descriptive statistics of the data, which shows that these three right here, as well as these three, are dummy variables because they don't have actual numeric values, so I use them sort of as like a characteristic of a certain period of time. My method was an OLS regression to measure the correlation between commercial sales and independent variables. I used Excel mainly to organize the data so that I could import it into SAS and create that regression. Here's the actual code from SAS that I included in here. The results, what I found was that these particular variables over here seem to have a really strong correlation, as well as total non-manufacturing employment. Weather seems to be a pretty big impact, which I hypothesized that it would be, as well as total population, because with more people, there's more workers, and more TVs. And what I found interesting was that total non-manufacturing employment in my model showed that it had a negative effect when I hypothesized that employment increases in general in any sector would increase power consumption, which this seems to have a negative correlation with it. These Alabama standard seems to be negatively correlated, but is insignificant, as well as the International Energy Code adopted by Georgia. LEED seems to have a pretty substantial impact, negative impact on power consumption. Also, actually, let me go to that. I also did the number of LEED buildings in Georgia and Alabama to see if it was the actual buildings or just the innovation that affected power consumption. And this shows that it is negatively correlated, but it's not very significant, which leads me to believe that the actual innovation from the design is what's lowering consumption. New residential population creates an increase in all sectors, like I mentioned. More customers, more workers. Weather seems to definitely be the biggest impact of what determines power consumption. Also, as I mentioned, LEED version 3 or 2009 is associated with lower power consumption in Georgia and Alabama. But the actual number of LEED buildings is negatively correlated with electricity usage. New efficiency standards seem to reduce consumption in commercial buildings, and the innovations definitely have a bigger impact. But thank you all for your time.